Hello and welcome to our session, today's session with Jennifer Jordan of IMD Business School. Before we start, before I invite Jennifer onto the stage, just a couple of housekeeping points just to run through. First of all, we like, for those of you who know CRF, we like our sessions to be as interactive as possible. So please do ask questions, share any thoughts, any challenges that you'd like to put to our speaker. We love a bit of controversy. So please use the chat function and the Q&A. I'm sure you're all very familiar with how these work on various platforms now. We also will be sharing a retrospective after the event. So we're recording all the sessions, and we'll also be putting together summary notes that will be shared in the next couple of days after the conference. So that will be available to you, and we'll look out for that in your inbox over the next couple of days. So without further ado, I'd love to hand over to Jennifer. Jennifer's going to be sharing some of her latest work and thinking on leading in the virtual world. So Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gillian. And once I share my slide, I should say that I can no longer see this screen. So I'm relying completely on you, Gillian, to let me know if there's any comments around my voice quality or being able to see my slides or the videos. So I'm trusting you here, but that means also Gillian can play with my mind a little bit and like give me all these hard questions, and I won't know if they're really from you. Rosie, good morning to you as well. So I'm going to start sharing my slides. Let's see here. Allow, there we go. Oh, you now see my desktop, I see. Good thing I don't have anything too incendiary on there. No, I think it's fine. So I think you see my slides now, and good morning from Lausanne. I'm here at IMD in my office, and I'll be talking about today leading in the virtual space. So what is unique? I'm a professor here of leadership and organizational behavior, but my area of focus for the last, I would say, 3 years has been specifically, actually almost exactly 3 years, has been specifically on leading in the digital age. What is unique about leading during a time of digital disruption? But then I think in the last 6 months, what digital disruption means has really changed or has shifted or has been shaped differently based on our experiences with COVID. And so with that, I'm going to be sharing some of my learnings in these last few months and integrating them with the work I've done before that. And as Gillian said, I think the more interactive as possible, the better. Otherwise, I feel super lonely here, sitting and looking at the camera alone in my office. So I would love to know that you're out there in virtual world, and by having you ask questions, be engaged, etc. So we're going to actually start with a breakout. I'm a lazy professor, so I'm going to pass it back over to you and start with a breakout where I want you to discuss at your tables. And I think this is such a cool platform where you actually have real tables. Although I have to say, the limousine that took me to the stage was not exactly as fun as being in a real limo, but I've only been in a limo a couple times in my life. But what are some of the fundamental differences between the real and virtual worlds that affect team functioning? So in your experience, what have been like the things that have separated or differentiated interacting in your teams in the real world versus interacting in your teams in the virtual world? So with that, over to you, Gillian. I think you and your team, Craig and Cray, are going to be putting you at tables, and then we'll come back in about 8 minutes, and I want to hear more from you, okay? So let me, I'm going to stop share. I'm going to let you go into your breakouts until about 12 after the hour. Mentioned, I think maybe the best way, do you agree, Gillian, is for them to write in the chat some of the fundamental differences that they're noticing?
Yeah, so if you can use the chat to share. Shall I just share one from my session, which I thought was really fascinating? One of our colleagues had been through budget reins and had discovered that the budget submissions were much higher than they would have seen in previous years. So there was a degree of sort of unreality going on. And so that sort of informal filtering that tends to happen when you run into people in the corridor and you have that ongoing dialogue around this is what I'm thinking for this year, and what do you think? And those revisions happen on the fly. We're clearly not happening in a virtual environment. So, you know, I thought that was really fascinating.
That is really interesting, because I think we know a couple things. One is that, like, when you exist in sort of a vacuum, right, without a social vacuum, without that feedback, sometimes you're just sort of hearing your own thoughts without, as you said, that kind of that ability to bounce it off of others, and sometimes you can lose touch with reality. But the other thing we know is that people are more likely to do things that are unethical. So maybe, you know, over project certain budget requirements or whatever, when they feel like they're more anonymous and when they're not being as identified. And so maybe there's also some of that going on when you are in your own, you know, in your own room, you feel a bit more anonymous and maybe free to do certain things you wouldn't feel free to do when you're in public. That's a really cool one. Thanks for sharing that, Jillian. I saw Andy says our table felt it was all about communication. Absolutely. I mean, we'll talk about verbal and nonverbal communication. Annabelle, yes, I think you were in my group. So that, like, spontaneous communication, that ability to use emotions. Philippa says Zoom team meetings involve essentially inviting people to your own home, which can be disconcerting. Absolutely, like, especially, you know, a colleague of mine said, you know, or actually it was a leader at a company, a pretty well-known leader. He's like, you know, Zoom in the virtual world is the ultimate equalizer, that everyone is sort of equal in the virtual world. And I was like, actually not, because I had been in a meeting that morning and I asked the person, I'm like, is that your real background or is that a fake background? And she's like, no, that's my home. And I'm pretty sure she lived in a castle. And then another guy in our group on the call was in a coat closet because he said this was the only place he could find to have quiet in his home. So I'm really not sure if it's a social equalizer as much as we think. I see from Joe body language from table 1. So Mariangeles, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, summed it up. Several topics were discussed. We see people making extra efforts, more intimacy. I think the extra efforts is very true. We'll get into that. More intimacy, more level playing field. I mentioned that a bit. Still, there are opportunities to acknowledge this is different and it has deficiencies. So, you know, not as spontaneous. To be inclusive, absolutely. Like, who are you having these touch points with? Are they your group, or are they, you know, are you bringing in new? I think one of the hardest things to do virtually, and many of you are probably facing this, is onboarding new employees or onboarding new team members. Okay, so I'm going to move back to my screen share, and then at this point I lose you guys again, so just bear with me. All right, you should see that now. So in my work in the last few months, as well as pre-COVID, I sort of sum up I sum up the fundamental differences between the real and virtual worlds in these 4 ways. One is the exchange of energy. So we know that human beings exchange energy. I mean, it sounds like super supernatural, but we do, as humans, have energy that we bring to the spaces around us. And so far, we haven't figured out technology to really transcend that virtual divide that we have. And that does affect our own energy. It affects the energy of those around us. The potential to read nonverbals beyond just the face. So, you know, if we have a Zoom call, we can certainly see people's face. If you have ever done any study around reading nonverbals, we know that the face is very, very important. But we also know that things beyond the face, people's shoulders, are they, you know, sitting upright? Are they sitting in a way that shows confidence, or are they kind of slumped down? Are they fidgeting in their chair? Where are their feet facing? All of that, maybe not consciously, but we unconsciously use that information. The potential to physically touch one another. I know that might sound a bit strange. I'll explain what I mean. But like giving someone a handshake when you meet them, or, you know, when you've had a good experience with your team, giving them a high five, giving someone a hug when they've had a difficult moment. We can't do that virtually. And I think sending someone, you know, a virtual handshake or a hug is not exactly the same. And then the chance of spontaneous meetings. And we mentioned that in the breakout table that I was at, I think it was table 5, that, you know, just seeing somebody in the hallway that you haven't seen in a while or that you need to connect with, and having that spontaneous meeting, that's much less likely to happen in the virtual world. So I'm going to go through each of these and talk about what have I seen in my research and in working with companies as ways to try to get around these four, you could call them roadblocks or differences, in the hope that we can, together find some additional ways, or maybe you've experienced some ways in your organizations that you can share with the group that we can use as well. So I'll start with the exchange of energy, and Jillian, again, please feel free to interrupt me at any time. So we know that teams share information in two ways, okay? They share information with open information sharing, which is just merely the volume of information shared. It often is not task related. It is often not unique to a certain member. So what I mean by that is if I get together with a group and we talk about before the meeting starts, what we had for dinner last night, and I cooked a new recipe with my family, that would be open information sharing. Maybe it is unique to me, but it certainly is not task related to the meeting that we're going to have. Or let's say that I talk about an episode that I'm watching in a series on Netflix. Maybe others in that room have also watched that episode. So then that's even not unique information. So that's those sort of side conversations. That's considered the open information sharing. Then we have the unique information sharing that happens in teams. And this is often information sharing that is task related, okay? And this is also information that is often privy to only one or two members of the group. So for example, I'm coming with a report based on the research that I did last week on a topic, or if I'm the head of the marketing department, some new marketing data or tests from a new advertising campaign that we've had. That would be unique information sharing. But what's interesting, and the researchers in this study found this to be true, is that 40% of the variance in teams' effectiveness was explained by how much open relative to unique information that people shared in their teams. So it wasn't the information that's about the task that you're doing, the task-oriented information, but it was the non-task-oriented information that explained the success or the effectiveness of the teams, which I think is so interesting, because one thing that people mention as a benefit of working virtually is that meetings tend to be more on point, that you have an agenda, you get through it, they're more efficient. But are they more effective, especially when it comes to team building? And so why is this open information sharing so important? It's important because this open information sharing is what makes teams feel cohesive, bonded together. They get to know each other. By the way, and this is research done before COVID, in general, virtual teams, and I mean teams that work 100% virtually, report less satisfaction in their teams than those who work face-to-face. Open information allows the team to develop social structures necessary for positive emotions, and it also builds greater team trust. This open information, sharing something that has nothing to do with the task, and we'll talk about trust building later on, is really important for that. I know you a little bit better. I have sort of a window into who you are, which is a key lever to build important trust within teams. I'm going to stop sharing here. I would love to hear, what have you done? I'm going to, okay, turn off screen sharing. I would love to see in the chat some of what you have done in your teams or you've seen in your organizations that people have done to stimulate that open information sharing, because I think we've learned a lot in these last couple months. So if you don't mind maybe sharing it in the chat, I can also speak about it aloud. So daily check-ins, Lulia says daily check-ins with the team for 30 minutes. Virtual coffee break, sure. Walks and talks. So Patricia, maybe you could elaborate on that. People bring their phones or they bring their smartphones and they walk and talk. Is that what you're saying? Virtual coffee catch up, virtual team drinks. I don't know what a yam jam is. So Annabelle, maybe you could add on that. I mean, another thing that I've seen organizations do is start every meeting with an open question. So like, I don't know if you've ever seen this list of 35 questions from the New York Times that lead to love. And they're just, I mean, it's about questions on a first date, but they're just questions that help people to open up. And they would be something like, if you could have dinner with anyone, what would it be? And they start the meeting going around based on the size of the team. It's more or less realistic, but they just start with some of these questions to get to know each other, which I think is a great way to stimulate open information sharing. Oh, I love that, Francis. Team playlists where team members suggest a song and a theme at the start of the week, and it goes out on the Friday. I really like that, especially as a music lover. That's a really cool way because you get to know people's music preferences as well. Nigel says something very similar, so very cool. So I hope maybe you can let us know, Jillian, if you will be saving this chat, and maybe we can send it out after, because I would love to look at some of the other points that people mentioned.
Absolutely. We'll be saving the chat and the questions, and that will be going in the retrospective as well.
Okay, super. Okay, so I think we see like the benefits of the open information sharing, super important for getting that energy flowing. It's interesting, we tend to think introverts are better in virtual environments than extroverts, which is true in a way. They're more comfortable and they're more happy in a virtual environment, but where they aren't better is that it's often the extroverts that are getting that energy going, because extroverts think aloud, they need to talk more, they need to connect. So it's sort of like the introverts bring the satisfaction because they're very happy working there, but the extroverts help to bring that energy, which is absolutely necessary in the group. The other one to think about is the attitude that you bring to your virtual team meetings. So we know that there are 5 different sort of styles that people engage in, especially when they're talking about difficult conversations. The first one is avoidance, okay? So this is just apathetic. I don't really care. I'm going to sort of step out. I'll let others make the decision. It's exactly what it sounds like. We have accommodation, which is also pretty passive, but you do engage in a way. It's fairly thoughtless. You're not putting a lot of energy in. You have competition. This is pursuit of each member's own interest. You're sort of showing your dominance in the group, etc. Collaboration, this is a more integrated outcome involving all parties, and then compromise, acknowledging differences and coming to some middle ground. And by the way, people often say, well, what is the difference between collaboration and compromise? I'm going to illustrate in a very simple one. Let's say you and your partner likes meat and you like fish, okay? Compromise would be saying, okay, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we eat fish, and on the other days of the week, we have meat, okay? That's compromise. And so that means on the nights that you have meat, you're not really happy. On the nights that you have fish, your partner's not really happy. That's compromise. Collaboration would be sitting together and saying, okay, what are some menus that we can make that have both fish and both meat, or we can make kind of like a basis of the side dishes, and then you cook a little fish and I cook a little meat. That would be collaboration, okay? So that's sort of how you differentiate those two. And in the real world, we know from research that avoidance is really negative in terms of team effectiveness and efficiency. Teams that have avoidant members have really low energy. They don't feel cohesive. They don't feel engaged. The other one that's really negative is competition. This is just bringing like this zero-sum mindset. You know, if you benefit, then I lose, and people kind of having the power play. The positive ones, and maybe this is not surprising, are collaboration and compromise in the real world. But it changes when we're in the virtual world. In the virtual world, we also know that avoidance is really negative. It just shows I don't care, I'm not engaged, I don't really want to involve myself in this team. What's interesting, though, is that accommodation is seen equal. People can't, in the virtual world, distinguish accommodation and avoidance, so they're sort of seen as equally negative. Collaboration is also very positive in the virtual world, but interestingly, so is competition. And you'd say, well, why is competition good in the virtual world? In the virtual space, it's like that competitive sort of dominance display gets lost, and people see a competitive mindset or a competitive engagement in the team as merely being motivated and energized and passionate. And sort of that, like the negative side of competition goes away. Compromise, by the way, was seen as neutral. It didn't have any positive or negative effects. And so what I want you to take away from this is not, okay, all of a sudden I need to encourage my teams to be more competitive or become more competitive, but rather become more competitive myself, but rather that importance of bringing that energy in and really being engaged and involved, maybe not in a competitive way, but in a way that shows that you're really motivated. And if you are a bit competitive, it might be actually seen more positively in the virtual world. So these are just a couple ways that we can think about getting or bringing more energy, or getting more of that energy flow amongst members in the virtual teams. The second one that I want to touch on here is the potential to read nonverbal.
Jennifer, should we just pause? We've got a question there. So before you go on to the next one. So
please, I'm going to stop sharing.
Can you hear me? Yes. So one question, when we've got some people working from home and others in the office, how do you create a level playing field? And I think that also sort of, maybe if you touch on that one.
Yeah, that's a really hard one. So most of the research, and my colleague Ina Togol knows about this better than I do, but most of the research says that's actually not a good setup, because it sort of creates like a fault line between those that are home and those, and I know for some of us, we have to do it, right? And I even teach sometimes in that way. I just did a program last week. Half the people were in the room, half the people couldn't travel because of quarantine lists, and so they were tuning in virtually, right? And the reason that is not so positive, and you probably already know this from experience, is that the people that are there together in the room sort of form a clique, and the people that are on the outside sort of feel left out, but they can also disengage much more easily. They have more distractions that are easily acceptable, etc. So what, in a situation like this, I mean, if you have to work in this way, the only thing we know how to sort of ameliorate some of the negative effects are the following. When you have breakouts, always make sure you're pairing an in-person member with somebody who is virtual. So they will sort of break the clique a little bit and get to know one another. So if you like build in breakout discussions, mix the real and virtual worlds. And then also another way to help get around this, because of that, that distraction, is making it very clear for the virtual people that videos, need to be on at all times. Please close your email, and have the same rule though for those that are face-to-face. Actually ask them to put their cell phones not even on the desk, but leave them at the door. So sort of creating a level playing field of, okay, we're all really, A, it emphasizes that engagement is really important, and B, as I said, it sort of makes it more fair in terms of, well, then if I can't be on looking at my phone, why do the people in the face-to-face world get to have their phone on the desk? By the way, I'm noticing I cooked with turmeric last night. I'm noticing my hands look a little yellow, and that is why. All right, Gillian, any other questions?
just given what the slide that you've just shared, and noting that there are different positives and negatives in different types of meetings, I just wonder if there is room for all virtual meetings, even when we can get together in person. Are there particular agendas that maybe would be better served by running meetings virtually in any event?
You mean certain types of meetings that just benefit more? That's a really good question. I mean, in some ways, and now I'm thinking spontaneously, I don't have any data to back this up, Jillian, but I'm thinking like meetings where you just have to, there's already been the discussion, there's already been the sharing, and now it's just a matter of agreement on certain things. I think in a way the virtual world can be more efficient about that. But I'm not sure. It's a really good question. Like, are there categories of meetings you'd want to put in one box or another? Do you have an idea?
Maybe we can ask the audience.
Yeah.
I'm still intrigued by the person who had difficulty with getting realistic budgets. So I wonder if they would have any insights to share around, setting budgets virtually. But so maybe we can ponder on that as we
It's like, I don't want to identify myself. And by the way, Sean Mills said the topology is based on Thomas Kilmann. Absolutely. I should have mentioned that. And I when I saw the slide come up, Sean, I was horrified that I didn't cite the authors. So thank you, Sean, for showing this not my research that I can claim.
And there's another question just popped up, Jennifer, and perhaps if you can weave this into your comments as we go forward, but which is around how to avoid quieter voices being drowned out in the virtual world. And that's often a very that's very much often where the wisdom lies. So we're missing out if we don't bring the quieter voices in the room. But maybe you can pick up on that as we go along.
So who mentioned that?
That was Jennifer Devalier.
Okay, Jennifer, great first name. So Jennifer, absolutely. I teach our MBAs here at IMD, and it's 90 people. And for a long time, we were doing it virtually, right? They're now back in the classroom. But we were doing it virtually. And as you can imagine, with 90 people, especially a lot of different cultures in that room, all the way from Asia to North America, right? And there are some cultures that just don't speak out as much as others, right? And so it's so much easier. In the classroom, I can kind of see the ones that are not engaging and I can call on them. And in the virtual world, it's so much easier with 90 people to have people just forgotten. And I don't think they really are intentionally disengaging. It's just that they, that's more of their nature, right? So what I started to do was cold calling on people and just letting them know at the beginning that, by the way, just to create more of that energy, any of you are subject to being cold called at any point. And I thought sometimes that would, because in certain Asian cultures, that ability to save face is really important. So I thought, what if I call on someone and they don't feel prepared? Are they going to think I'm putting them on the spot? But I actually never found that. I found that they were really grateful to be called on. And there is a website, and I'm so sorry that I don't know the name. I can try to find it. It's a website, and you just submit, like, let's say you have 5 team members. You submit an Excel or these 5 names, and it's a random selector. It's like a roulette wheel, and it goes around with the names, and it will just stop on a name. And so if you want to show like you're really being random in terms of who you call on, you can use that, like screen share. You go around on the little wheel, and it stops at, I don't know, Sam, and you're like, okay, so Sam, you answer that question. And it's kind of a fun way I started doing it because I think probably I was not being completely random in my choice. So then I was showing like I was being random in who I called on. Anything else? No. Okay, I'm going to go back to my slides. Screen share. There we go. All right, so I'm going to move to the second one, the potential to read nonverbals beyond just the face and the potential to physically touch one another. And nonverbals are so important. I noticed I was in a meeting last week, a virtual meeting, and it was sort of a touchy topic. And I noticed the person I was talking to answering the question and going like this, right? And we know that from work on nonverbals, when people are holding their neck, they're sort of protecting subconsciously or unconsciously, I don't know the difference, subconsciously protecting their jugular. And so what they're essentially doing is like saying, I want to protect myself. I don't want to put myself out there. And that was really important nonverbal information for me. Now, it's a bit hard to do that, if you don't have video. Luckily, we had video, and luckily I could see this. But these are important cues that we take either consciously or unconsciously. So a couple of things that I just wanted to mention are ways to get these emotional check-ins, to get how people are feeling when you can't read their full bodies in terms of their behavior and their tendencies. One way is to just do, if you have a lot of psychological safety in that team, if you feel comfortable, doing an aloud check, like starting off the meeting and just saying, how do you feel today? I would also recommend doing it at the beginning. And by the way, this is advice from my colleague here who studies, she has her PhD in emotional intelligence or in that topic. And this is advice that she provides. So Sean, see, I'm citing the author here, or the brainchild behind this. She said, start meetings with a check-in and say, no one can say good. Like you can't say I'm doing good. You have to choose another adjective, but you do it at the beginning of the meeting and then at the end. Now, this only works if you know each other, if there's some psychological safety, because otherwise people are not going to be open. If it's a team that's more new, that you don't know each other, use an annotated slide. So something like this, and I think most of us know how to, on Zoom calls, put up a slide that people can annotate. They just put an X somewhere. And so you would say at the beginning, just randomly put your X about how are you feeling. And this is like Silka recommends the high energy, low energy, pleasant and unpleasant. So high energy pleasant would be something like I'm excited. Low energy pleasant would be something like I'm satisfied. I'm sort of I'm content. High energy unpleasant would be something like anger or aggression, and then high unpleasant low energy would be something like I'm feeling a bit depressed or down. And you have people know it. And I think as a leader, the nice part of this is it's anonymous. So you don't sort of know who puts the X where. And you can have a discussion and say, I see we have a few members today that are feeling a little bit down. Could anyone, for example, want to share why that might be? Is it anything having to do with the way the team is working right now? And maybe what can we do to sort of cheer these members up, and just have that conversation. And I think it's really interesting as a leader, are you, number one, comfortable having that vocabulary around emotions? But it's a really nice way to get that emotional check-in as well without doing it aloud, which can sometimes be awkward for certain people. The other one, and this sounds like, I always find using emoticons sort of unprofessional, but there's like the wow, there's the smiley face, and my personal favorite, the smiley poo. But there's actually a good amount of research in the area of communication showing that using emoticons provides a lot of positive benefits to working. Yeah, it might seem a little childish or silly, but there's actually, when you're working virtually, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a way to sort of connect. That people that use emoticons, first of all, give a better context to what they're saying. So they have less misunderstandings between people because they can say something that's sarcastic. And maybe, we know sarcasm is very culturally dependent. And so sometimes that sarcasm is lost in communication, or the fact that it's a joke is lost in communication in the virtual world, especially. And so using some of these emoticons actually help reduce some misunderstandings. They also, from the work that I cite below, they also found that people that use emoticons, they enjoy communicating more virtually, and the person who receives them finds it more emotionally uplifting and brings more energy into the message. So getting to that first bullet point as well, it brings a bit of more energy. Now, I wouldn't recommend, writing to an important client on a serious matter using, a smiley poop in your message, or like, your CEO and putting a wink. But I think there are times and contexts where, we might hesitate to use them, and yet they're very useful. I'm going to stop here before I get to the last one, which is about the chance of spontaneous meetings. And I am going to turn it over to Jillian to say, are there any questions here?
Okay. We're getting some emoticons in the chat. That's for sure. Yes, there. Let me just scroll up a little bit. There was a really good point from, if I can just find it. This was from around having difficult conversations from Sarah. Have you any tips on having difficult conversations virtually?
Yeah, I have a few. I mean, we could have a whole webinar on that. I like to, and I think I can write in the chat. Very good. I'm not going to use an emoticon here. Okay, so when I do a difficult conversation, when I do a difficult conversation, I like James. I love the little monkeys. See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. I like those. Okay, so when I have a difficult conversation, I'm going to keep this brief. It's a great question. And this framework comes from Susan Goldsworthy, who is a co-author on the book. It's about Care to Dare with George Cole Reiser. So again, not my framework. You're going to think like, well, what does this woman do? Every framework is about her own. But I heard
Susan speaking this morning, because she did a this morning.
Oh. Did she mention SOCCQ?
She was talking about change. So yeah.
Okay. Outcome, choices, concessions, and questions. Okay. So when you have a difficult conversation, real or virtual, thinking about these 5 components, I think, can be very, very helpful. First of all, what is the state you're coming to this in? Are you angry? Are you apprehensive? Are you nervous? So just putting that down, but also imagining the state the other person is in. And in the virtual world, that's really important to have that empathy, because you're going to be less likely to feel or to sense those sort of emotions from the other side when you're working virtually. Okay, so really imagining what their state might be, and it just helps you to put yourself in their mindset. The other one is outcome, because I think when we get into the virtual space, especially, it's really easy to lose track of where ultimately do we want to get to in this conversation. What do we want to accomplish? In sort of one sentence, what are we aiming for? Okay, so that would be the state, and really being very deliberate, writing it down for you. It helps to direct the conversation. The second one is choices. So choices are thinking about, what choices can I give to the other side? Because sometimes when we're working virtually, especially, we can feel a bit alone or cornered or put on the spot when we have these kind of intense virtual meetings. And so choices help to expand that and say, okay, this is really a dialogue between the two of us. I'm not coming in here trying to kind of impose something on you. And then concessions, and any of you who have done work on negotiations, we often think of concessions of what do we give the other side. Concessions are things we look for from the other side that tells us the conversation is going in the right or the wrong direction. So something like, you know, if someone is having this conversation, they're sitting like this, right? They're sort of anxious, they're not feeling, and then all of a sudden the hand goes down. That's the concession the other side gives us that we know the conversation is going in the right direction. And emotionally, you need to sort of think about, how do I grab onto that and use that positive energy, and maybe start asking them the last component, the questions. Sort of, how are you feeling about this right now? Or what are the emotions you're coming to the situation with? And I think when we're working virtually, it's very easy to get into our own box, and we forget those questions, that inquiry that we can get, that we need to have with the other side. And, you know, when we think about the other person's state, that's an assumption we make. What can we do to sort of check on that other person's the state by asking them questions? Or, you know, how do you perceive this, or how do you feel? And I think in the virtual world, it's even more important to have this dialogue. So that was my, Jillian, that was like my 3-minute summary of how to have difficult conversations in the virtual world. Thank Susan for this model. I hope it's valuable to some people. Shall I go back?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. We've got we've got about 13 minutes left. So yeah.
I saw that. Yes, and I see that you have like virtual drinks, and then Jennifer said we can also do virtual cheese tasting. You know, there's always someone that's going to be excluded. Like, I'm really allergic to milk, and Jillian knows this. So I couldn't do the virtual cheese tasting. I would rather do the wine tasting, which at, you know, 12 o'clock in the morning, 11 o'clock could be a problem. Okay, let us go back to the slides. Last one, we miss that chance of spontaneous meetings, right? It's like you know, seeing someone in the hallway that you haven't seen. And even during COVID, I find these spontaneous meetings when you're face to face are less likely to happen. First of all, it's sort of awkward when we have to wear masks at work. So it's sort of awkward when you have the mask on to like come up to somebody, and then you can't really hear them or understand them sometimes. And then half the time, I don't know who these people are. And I realize that you really use the full face sometimes to tell your colleagues apart when you don't know them that well, right, to begin with. So I think just during COVID, this is being jeopardized or being lessened. I'm going to ask Cray to play a video. It's a short video. It's a bit of a controversial video, not because of the video itself or the contents, but because of the speaker. It's a TED Talk. It's a very short clip from a TED Talk. And it is Stanley Mcchrystal, who was he's retired, I believe, 4-star general in the Army. And he talks about having in his own life or his own career, go from face-to-face combat to leading a combat team virtually, and the challenges that he's had specifically around building trust. Okay, so Cray, it's showtime. Play that video. I'm going to try to mute myself.
And after the battle, they bring this mobile theater and they do what they call an after-action review to teach you what you've done wrong, sort of leadership by humiliation. They put a big screen up and they take you through everything, and then you didn't do this and you did do this, etc. I walked out feeling as low as a snake's belly in a wagon rut. And I saw my battalion commander because I had let him down. And I went up to apologize to him, and he said, "Stanley, I thought you did great." And in one sentence, he lifted me, put me back on my feet, and taught me that leaders can let you fail and yet not let you be a failure. When 9/11 came, 46-year-old Brigadier General Mcchrystal sees a whole new world. First, the things that are obvious that you're familiar with. The environment changed, the speed, the scrutiny, the sensitivity of everything now is so fast. Sometimes it evolves faster than people have time to really reflect on it. but everything we do is in a different context. More importantly, the force that I led was spread over more than 20 countries. And instead of being able to get all the key leaders for a decision together in a single room and look them in the eye and build their confidence and get trust from them, I'm now leading a force that's dispersed. And I've got to use chat, I've got to use email, I've got to use phone calls, I've got to use everything I can, not just for communication, but for leadership. A 22-year-old individual operating alone, thousands of miles from me, has got to communicate to me with confidence. I have to have trust in them and vice versa. And I also have to build their faith. And that's a new kind of leadership for me. We had one operation where we had to coordinate it from multiple locations. An emerging opportunity came, didn't have time to get everybody together. So we had to get complex intelligence together. We had to line up the ability to act. It was sensitive. We had to go up the chain of command, convince them that this was the right thing to do, and do all of this on electronic medium. We failed. The mission didn't work. And so now what we had to do is I had to do reach out to try to rebuild the trust of that force, rebuild their confidence, me in them and them in me, and our seniors in us as a force, all without the ability to put a hand on a shoulder. Entirely new requirement.
So thank you, Cray, for sharing that video. I think there's a couple things that are very meaningful to me from that video. The first one is that he says we have to use electronic medium now, just not for communication, but for leadership. And I think that's a whole different way of thinking about it, right? That Zoom isn't just a way that I communicate, but it's really now a way I have to lead. I have to connect with people. I have to influence them. I have to motivate them, which is, I think, just a different mindset to bring to what that interaction is about. But the other one that sticks with me is that leaders let people fail and not be a failure. I think that is such a beautiful statement, and it's something that is so true, right? As leaders, how do we let people fail but not be a failure, right? And so I like to think about trust as divided into 3 C's. And by the way, I did put this framework, so this might be the only thing I can say. I did put this framework together. There's probably something similar out there. But the first one I would call care. And this is like, we develop trust through sharing or keeping secrets, empathizing with others, showing interest in their well-being, sacrificing my own well-being, giving a little bit of myself to them. And then there's the authenticity side, right? I call it this like the kind of the certifiable you. This is really who you are. And this is showing vulnerability, admitting things, admitting strengths, weaknesses, taking responsibility for your actions, being open to criticism, being consistent with what you say and what you do, being transparent and open, and then also that kind of that similarity, finding something to connect yourself with others. And then the last one I'm going to call the competence part of trust. This is sort of the more cognitive side of trust. And this is that you know what you're talking about, your expertise and your track record. And we talked about, one thing in the digital age that is different is that we don't have that spontaneity of the meeting. So while I think it's very easy for us to still develop that competence-based trust, which is where, we show our expertise, we show what we're talking about, I think it's a bit harder to often find opportunities to show that care and that authenticity sometimes, right? And so I pose that question here: which of these are easier or harder to develop in the virtual world, and are some more important than others? And I've actually done research on this. And we find that, the ones that are more important, interestingly, in the virtual world are, number one, the sharing and keeping secrets. Why is that? In the virtual world, it is so easy to forward things accidentally or intentionally that people would like to keep, between 2 people. And so that really ability to be discreet and to be confidential is really important in the virtual world. And also now, because we have more millennials coming in, that sort of certifiable you is becoming more important. That being open, even as a leader, to criticism, being consistent between what you say and what you do. And also, because it's easier, it's harder to sort of, I don't want to use the word, like exaggerate what you know in the virtual world. It's easier to check. Are you really able to carry out a goal that you intend to? that knowing what you're doing and talking about is really important in a virtual space. Can people rely on you? It's also because they can't be micromanaged as much in the virtual world. The ones, though, that are easier are showing interest in others' well-being. So through things like, WhatsApp or just checking in, it's easy to show, how are you doing today? Or I've been thinking about you, these quick touch points. Also open communication. We live in a world of more transparency. It's more open information. Information is a great equalizer in the virtual world. And then also expertise and track record. And I think what's nice about the virtual world is you don't have to say it about yourself. You can post an article that you've written on LinkedIn, or someone can recommend you on LinkedIn or whatever. You're not boasting about yourself, but you're showing your competence. The ones that I found to be more challenging specifically are the empathizing, like really showing that you're understanding someone's position or trying to understand and trying to connect and build trust that way. And then the other one is the similarity, and I put the question mark there. I think because there's sort of two sides to this. With similarity, the positive side is that I think it's easier to find sort of points that you can connect with people, that you have similarity, maybe like the virtual playlist. Oh, I really like that same song as somebody else, even though we might be from different cultures, different genders, etc., right? Different ages maybe, or different generations. The hard part, though, is that we are in the virtual world working with more diverse teams. And so that likelihood that you will have something similar that you connect with initially with that other person might not be absolutely apparent to you. And so you have to do a little bit more homework to connect on that similarity point. So that's why I have it sort of as a question mark. But what I would want you to leave this slide with is this idea that, okay, there's some things I'm going to need to work on or keep in mind more, which is that secret keeping, that openness, that transparency, but then other things like maybe putting a little bit more emphasis also into the similarity and the finding ways to really show empathy in the virtual world. And I think that is not necessarily a replacement for the spontaneity, which is a basis for developing this trust, these conversations you have over lunch or in the hallway, but can help maybe emphasize or build trust in other ways. So
Jennifer, just to point out, we've only got a couple of minutes left now, so
I have takeaways, and then we're all finished. Fantastic. So in virtual teams, a few things to think about. Think about how to encourage that open information sharing. I saw some great stuff in the chat. Emphasize the energy that you bring via your communication style, via different ways that you're engaging, bringing motivation into the meetings, using your extroverts in those type of ways. Take an emotional check-in, and don't be afraid of using emoticons in certain contexts where you think they're relevant. And lastly, consider the unique ways to build trust in the virtual space. And with that, I am finished. I think we have time maybe for a question before we end here.
Yeah, fantastic. We've got time, for one question. So Philippa Crompton, one thing that Philippa's seeing is managers are feeling under real pressure to keep their teams motivated, as well as dealing with their own experiences of lockdown, and that's tough. So you've got, this sort of, how do you keep your team motivated while dealing with your own challenges and motivators? So how do we better support?
I would go to that third or that second pillar of trust building, the certifiable you, and be transparent. I think there's nothing that's more motivating than to know you're not alone. And so I think we as leaders often think, okay, being a leader is being that strong, stable, stalwart presence. And I think to some extent that is true, but I think it also is really important to say I'm struggling with certain things too, or it's really hard for me to, when I have to work at home, and also if my kids are still being homeschooled, it's very challenging for me to balance that attention. I sort of know what you're going through. It helps emphasize the empathy. So I think being emotionally calm and steady is important, but also sharing your vulnerabilities can be really powerful for helping to connect and build vulnerability and trust.
Okay, and Alistair asked a really interesting question, which is, how do we move from leadership through the sort of hand on the shoulder, very kind of present, leading through presence to how we develop that presence and present ourselves virtually as leaders?
Yeah, and quickly, Alistair, great question. I would say a couple things I've seen work. One is knowing when a one-on-one is needed and when a reach out is needed. The other one that I've seen a CEO that I know do is that every team meeting he rotates, it's a smaller team, he rotates and asks each member to join in 7 minutes early. And he just has a touch point of saying, okay, how are you doing? You know, you told me last time you were struggling with this. How is it going? And having that one-on-one with people and being more thoughtful about, do I need to step in and show I'm present and show I care? I mean, so far, I don't think we really have a good virtual analogy for the hand on the shoulder or the, you know, the hug. And I'm not sure if we're going to find one. I mean, I think this might be a generational thing. Perhaps if you're raised more as a virtual native, you do find the emoticons comforting to you. But for someone who definitely didn't grow up as a virtual native, I haven't seen a great analogy for that.
Okay, unfortunately our time is up, but I'd just like to thank Jennifer for a fantastic session, and for me particularly practicing what you preach. So the way that you've engaged the audience I think has been really inspiring. So I've really enjoyed this session. You can see more of Jennifer if you join our panel session, which is the final session of the day. Jennifer is going to be sticking around with us and sharing some more thoughts on her work for that. So thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you to all our participants, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.